Oh, the joy of getting old. I went to the store the other day to buy a loaf of bread, and after going through the checkout, the gentleman who was bagging the groceries turned to me and said, "Would you like for me to carry this to your car?" And I said, "How about I carry the bread and you carry me?" So today is a story about another gentleman of age, Moses, the story of Moses in the burning bush, the story as old as Vacation Bible School. Our reading today of Moses having a confrontation with the eternal is powerful on two fronts. First, it offers us a sense of the characteristics of Moses as he becomes the mediator between God and the Israelites. And secondly, there are lessons that we can learn when we have a confrontation with the eternal. Many ministers of recent times have focused mostly on the calling and vocation of Moses and the need for people today to hear that same message. That is noteworthy for sure. But as your speaker today, I wish to focus on the primary character in the passage, which is best described as Yahweh, which translates to the great I am. AI, artificial intelligence, tells me that Moses is the most popular character of the Old Testament. I would challenge that, on the other hand, and reference the word Yahweh and suggest something to the contrary. Depending on the translation, the word Yahweh is used over 8,000 times in the Old Testament books. Need I say more? But first, a snapshot of Moses. That's a strange name, isn't it? Moses. Kind of unique. Well, it's strange because it's Hebrew. And the word means literally one who's taken from water. And ironically, that same man who was taken from water is now about to play with fire. Using the Myers-Briggs personality test, we better understand Moses as one who is introverted, intuitive, a man of sincere feelings, and he's able to judge with a balanced perspective. Pretty solid characteristics for Moses, and relevant to his call as he confronts the eternal. And so here he is on just another stroll up the mountain, minding his own business, doing what he loves best, herding the sheep in the barren wasteland of Sinai. And then, some say, it happened. Those of us as believers better understand it as the holy happened. At first glance, Moses thought for sure what he saw was just an ordinary shrubby old bush that was flaming in the desert. And then realizing the reality of what was happening, he soon discovered something even stranger. That bush wasn't turning to ash. For the very first time, Moses is about to experience the extraordinary breaking into the ordinary. Or perhaps we would say, Moses had his ordinariness broken. Wrestling with his sense of unworthiness, Moses was curious and wanted to know more about the bush. And much like him, we often hesitate, and sometimes we want to beg the clock to stop until we have time to figure things out. We yearn for a time out in life. And that is the very moment when we discover our time is not always God's time. Here we see Moses starting to rethink his faith and the life of his people The extraordinary had consumed Moses, and he's coming alive with the reality and totality of God. Oh, fasten your seatbelt, Moses. Hold on to that steering wheel with both hands, because you are about to meet the great I am. From this point forward, nothing will ever be ordinary again. Pray with me. Indeed, we are reminded that if we draw near to God, God will draw near to us. Father, grant us the wisdom and the illumination needed for understanding you more deeply. Our minds thirst for your wisdom in your soul, and our soul seeks the kind of understanding that surpasses all human comprehension. In humbleness and in hope, we earnestly reach out to you this hour. Amen. Let me ask you a question. Raise your hand. How many of you have met someone famous besides your mother? How many? Somebody famous. My goodness, we got to get you folks out there. I remember when I was in graduate school at Princeton, I had a little side business. Now, it's not what you think. I had a side business of taking care of people's homes when they traveled or were away. And I met some people that were famous. Peter Benchley, Christopher Reeve took care of his mother's home and took his little brother to Princeton Day School every day while they were out filming the first Superman. But here's a concept. Have you ever imagined God as being famous? He's certainly the subject of some of the greatest art and sculptures known to man. He's known in every nation of the world. Pick up the hymnal in front of you and look how many times the word God is worshiped and praised. He's the discussion of endless scholarly debates worldwide. And I would go so far as to say that he is the hope for many believers and followers of all nations. There are not that many people on the face of this earth who have not heard of him in some way or another. There is great knowledge about God in our world and in our land, but how many of us can truly confess we not only know about God, but we truly know God? Knowing him and knowing about him are two very different things. We all know enough about Moses to safely assume that he possessed quite a bit of knowledge about God. After all, he grew up in the Pharaoh's house, and needless to say, even God's enemies knew about him. There's little doubt in my mind that God's name came up frequently in conversations. But it was here on this day, in one of the most unassuming places on earth, old man Moses was on the verge of going beyond knowing about God to actually knowing God. Most of us know the favorite hymn, "Near My God to Thee." Supposedly that was the last song being played on the Titanic while it was sinking. But have you ever really listened to the words that were sung? Though like the wanderer, the sun go down, darkness be over me, my rest a stone. That's not a very likely place to feel near to God. So by my woes to be near my God to thee. And that's not easy to listen to. We prefer to finding God in life's joys and positive experiences. We relish the moments when we find the good times. Praise God for all the blessings flow. That is where we prefer to find him, in our blessings. But what about the darkness and the times of need? Where is God when we ask the question, why me? In our most difficult times of life, I would imagine most of us feel as though God is nowhere to be found. Moses was in such times, and he never lost his God. He actually found him. Finding God in the best of times, absolutely. But sooner or later, all of us come to a place where if we are to find God at all, we must seek him in the worst of times and in the worst of places. All throughout the Bible, the word wilderness is used, and it's always a metaphor for a time and place where we are most vulnerable. It's at times in our lives we have a weakened state of mind. Our spirit is broken, and our mind entertains all questioning of life. One of my most favorite spirituals of all time is Jesus walked this valley, he had to walk it by himself. You know that song? Raise your hand. Standing alone in the darkness moments, we often ask the profound questions, God, whatever happened to you? God, what happened to me? God, whatever happened to you and me? It is there in the dark of night that we often learn to trust that which we do not see. It is where we transform faith from a question to an answer. Not only does life render each of us uncompromising situations, but our whole era is filled with moments of uncertainty. Yet, it is in those very moments of being vulnerable that we often discover the greatest mysteries of our God. It was Moses that reminds us in Exodus that drew unto the thick darkness where God was. Certainly, that is good news for humanity, that God is knowable. Dr. Paul Turner was a physician and a psychiatrist, and he was a go-to writer that most pastors refer to for pastoral perspectives in his writings. And he wrote that no one person can find real life without the feeling of being fully understood by another person. A person misunderstood is a person without self-confidence, without faith in life, and a person without a God. No one comes to know himself through introspection or in solitude of his personal diary. What we have here, even in the darkest of places, is the eternal King of glory revealing himself to us, and hear how it is so. Every confrontation with the eternal validates our need to be understood, our need to trust, and our need to feel worthy. I am wholeheartedly convinced that a confrontation with the eternal takes place where we are, no matter where we are. It's an all too common fallacy that we must go to a special place to meet God, a church, a tabernacle, a sanctuary, or a temple. Folks, let's be real. That simply goes against the grain of his omnipresence. Let me assure you, the same God who speaks and acts in this church and in cathedrals and temples and synagogues around the world will also speak to the people on the backside of the darkest desert as well. Hear the good news, the wondrous knowledge that God meets us where we are, anywhere, any place, anytime. Whether it's on the mountain peak or stormy seas or in a place of tranquility, the Eternal can, and often does, speak to us. Secondly, I suggest to you that God establishes contact with his people through both the ordinary and the extraordinary. Do you think for a moment that Moses saw a bush burning every time he turned around? Moreover, a bush that didn't turn to ashes. Perhaps for the first time, Moses realized the symbolism of the bush represented God's presence that does not destroy, rather it empowers and calls forth. Moses was beginning to lean in. The burning bush was something unusual and not ordinary at all. I would go so far as to say it was extraordinary. Over the years, scholars have debated what may have been the name that God revealed to Moses from the burning bush. The most common theory is the word Yahweh. It is noteworthy to remind you, in the Hebrew language, there are no vowels. Hence, if you were to write the word God, it would be spelled G-D. And the word Yahweh, that we know so well, having been spelled with all consonants, is a form of the Hebrew word for the verb to be. Yahweh then could mean several translations. Am who I am who I will be who I will be, I am being who I am being, or I am the Great One. To the people like Moses and much like us, God must sometimes bring something fresh and unusual and very different into our lives. To those of us who get locked in a routine, a habit, or a pattern, God all too often steps in with the miraculous, the startling, and the unique. God often does his best work in the worst of times. As well, God is also seen in a way of identifying himself. It would appear obvious that with the miraculous happenings going on, it is God that is in charge. But the presence of God is not taken for granted here. God speaks and identifies himself as the Holy One. It is worth noting that a meeting with the Eternal will always start with the awareness that he is the other. Though we may be unworthy, we are still invited to be in his presence. The ground that was so ordinary suddenly becomes extraordinary as God and Moses speak. It is then that God begins to lay out his calling card and informs Moses there's been a personnel change in heaven. There's been no personal change in heaven. I am the God, your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That was something Moses could comprehend and understand. For remember, Moses had heard much about God prior to the confrontation. But why do you imagine God called Moses aside? What do you suppose was really on his mind? It is the speaker's conviction that God called Moses aside to remind him that God was still active and concerned in the world. We're reminded in verse 7, I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I've heard the cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. Isn't that good to hear? Let me repeat. I know their sufferings. God sees, God hears, and God knows. Not sure about you, but I can go far with that kind of assurance. No matter what happens, we have this confidence. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob sees us, hears us, and knows us. I would imagine there were times in the life of Moses when he felt like asking, "Where is God?" Like many of us, I wonder also if he ever thought God was unconcerned or just too busy for us. There's little doubt in my mind that Moses had seen his share of dark days and sleepless nights. As the oppression of the Egyptians became more and more intense, Moses saw more and more injustice. He would no doubt start to second guess the love of God, and eventually his faith would be brought into question. In the world in which we live, many see the world hunger situation, the unequal distribution of the wealthy, and the more obvious denial of the poor, and needless people being killed for wasted wars. And we ask, where's God? How desperately we all need the miracle that take time to investigate and thereby hear the words that only He, the Eternal, can speak. I have seen, I have heard, and I know. Confrontation with God will always give us a glimpse of the character of God. And finally, I am suspect that when we meet God, we will be challenged with an assignment for us. At the age of 80, on the backside of the desert, guess who was called into service? Moses, standing before God, might be heard saying over and over again, "Why me?" God pays little attention to Moses' mumbling and wastes no time to call him into service. Clearly, God is saying, "Moses, if you're willing, I'm able." This was a real problem that Moses had. Some suggest in great psychological style that Moses had a poor self-image and that he had poor self-concept. One of the problems today is often that we are influenced by two sciences that deal primarily with life as it is, sociology and psychiatry. And I have no qualms with either. And certainly both have merit and proper perspective. But the good news that we hear today has to do with life as it might become. And if God calls you aside and speaks to you, it is because He has a calling for you. The enormity of the kind of calling Moses was experienced is enough to make any modern disciple to question their ability. It is not that we don't think we're able, we just don't think we can do it. It is our faith that comes into question, and when it does, we must learn it's not only we as individuals can respond to that calling or task that God presents to us. Faith is like taking a bath. No one can do it for you. It is a promise of God that God gave to Moses in our reading. The word comes to those who answer God's call with, "Yes, yes, I can do it." It comes to those who have a general theosis of living for Christ. It is the glorious news that if we seek to serve, we will not go alone. To the untamed shepherd, God promises, "I will be with you." That eliminates some of the fear for me if I can know that out of the confrontation with the Eternal, there will come an assignment and a promise. I'm encouraged. I have hope. When God calls, He will also accompany. One of New York's most celebrated highlights is Rockefeller Center. This prominent site occupies over 12 acres of ground and includes more than 15 modern 20th century buildings. Rockefeller Center is famous for the glittering 4-story bronze statue of the great titan of ancient Greek mythology, Atlas, which stands at 45 feet tall and weighs 7 tons. The statue embodies the mythological figure of Atlas from the ancient Greek mythology. And he was punished by the gods to bear the weight of the world on his shoulders for all of eternity. It is a message of strength and endurance to the fullest extent. Sitting directly across Fifth Avenue from Atlas is a building of a different kind, St. Patrick's Cathedral. Its every square inch exists to facilitate praise to the God that sees all, hears all, and knows all. The Grand Cathedral was built 60 years before the Atlas statue was erected. Void of any premeditated planning, the tormented face of Atlas, forever grimacing in pain and stress, carrying the weight of the world, not only faces true north, but is forever staring directly at the cathedral's front doors. When the massive bronze front doors are open, weighing 9,200 pounds and measuring 16 feet tall, are opened each day, Atlas is forever looking into the deep sanctuary, down the long main aisle of the church, all the way to the altar. Therein lies the story of a cosmic irony. In front of the altar of the church at St. Patrick's, there's a small statue of Christ Child in a serene stance, holding the cosmos in the palm of his hand. For those of us faith-filled believers, we realize the heavens are no back-breaking burden, but our final destination. And the earth is no paradise, but a turnpike, the way in which we pass to our celestial end. Human excellence, then, reaches its highest pitch by cleaving to the God that sees, the God that hears, and the God that knows. Seek God first in the obvious places, so that you are prepared to someday find him in the most unlikely of places. Amen.